Good evening. I think my granddaughter was playing with the backgrounds.
Did you use your computer today? Okay, so you guys are live.
Hi, Colin. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Hi, so Dr. Fergus is here. So whenever you're ready.
Welcome, Dr. Fergus. And yes, and welcome everybody. First of all, I would just want to say the audio in that room now that I'm remote is really amazing. So awesome. Good. So I guess at 6:45, we can call this board workshop to order. Tonight, we're going to have an update on some of the equity and proportionality work we have been doing this year. Dr. Fergus is going to lead us in some of his findings, and I'm going to kick it over to Dr. Estrella to introduce us.
Thank you. So this evening, like Mr. Colin articulated, we are going to be talking about the findings from our equity project. Dr. Fergus will provide us with recommendations of the work that, around the work that he did and some of the next steps that we as a district need to take into consideration to continue to move the work forward. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Fergus.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening.
I'm like, so thank you for the invite to follow up from the last time I think we met, which was in February, no, end of January, I think. It was on a Saturday, if I remember correctly, where we got an opportunity to kind of walk through the where we were in terms of the project. And one of the things we wanted to make sure we came back to was the set of recommendations, right? And so I'm gonna walk through the recommendations. And, one of the things I'll contextualize first is, part of what I'm always very mindful of in doing a project like this is making sure that the recommendations stay very close to what the data actually is telling us, right? And what I mean staying close to the data is staying close to, because a lot of this was one perceptual in terms of what people are experiencing, how they're understanding what's happening. We want to sort of really make sure that we're lifting up how, and recognizing sort of what it has actually meant for staff and for parents to have these particular experiences, and also being able to connect it with other sorts of data as well. So try to make sure that the recommendations stay in line with what we know. So I guess this work? Nope.
Did it or?
No, I don't know. Where am I pointing? What do you think?
Oh, yeah, it's towards me. On?
Yeah, it's on.
Well, I'll figure this out.
Oh, there we go. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Ralph. All right, so let me start first by really framing out the recommendations. They really sort of emerged in, given the data and the report that, it's been pulled together. As you saw, there was such a range of information that not only was gathered, but also what we learned from that information that really sort of tells a particular story of how the community has experienced, and as well as staff has experienced as well, and made sense of what it's meant for the school district to address and pay attention to equity issues throughout the community, throughout the school district. And in particular, the issues of equity are around the disparities that are existing in terms of who's ending up in special education and who's not, who's ending up experiencing higher levels of discipline versus not, and then who's getting enrolled in gifted AP and honors, right? As a bit of our sort of launching pad, the recommendations really fell into sort of what I consider two strands, right? One strand is paying attention to this idea of improved adequacy and efficiency of the supports, right? Not only sort of what do we have, but it's also the wellness to which it's existing to actually meet the needs of the kids who we are serving, and the degree to which it's operating at an efficient level, right? And I would imagine, and I know from some of the conversations we've had previously that, some of this language is probably in concert with the other reports that have also sort of pointed at sort of the efficiency elements of how some of our the services are provided within the school district. So under that, there is sort of two big areas, right? One is around sort of intervention supports. So how are we serving adequately and efficiently the various needs of diverse learners within our community, right? Particularly knowing that there are, there's a lot of requests across the community for a lot of support for kids, right? And so the question has to be, the adequacy of it, right? How well is it available for everyone, and the degree to which it is efficiently running to meet the needs of the kids that we are actually serving here in Norwalk. And then the other piece around improved adequacy and efficiency is around this whole communication piece, right? That it came up amongst all of the constituents that we actually talked to. And I'll talk a little bit more about that communication piece. The other strand is around improved access and perspectives on diversity, equity, and inclusion. In particular, this access piece is the nature to which there is a sense within the community that what they are experiencing, is it operating at a level where they actually feel as if there is an equitable opportunity for them to know about and to be engaged in the types of services that are available throughout the school district. And I'll talk a little bit more about that And that really came up strongly. I have to say, because I think we did the parents first, the parents really told us a lot of what they shared their own narratives around how they've experienced limited or extensive access to certain services. And then the staff, in some ways, really amped it up even more because they could tell their own examples, right? And by and large, there was parallel between both parents and staff. And then the other piece is around the perspectives that both the community and the school staff have around diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? There's such a sort of a range of perspectives that are existing. So, all right, I'm going to start first with this improved adequacy and efficiency of supports. So the first hand, around the I'm going to look at it here so I can see it a little better. Okay, great. Thank you. So, the first, as you'll see, at the core of really what is outlined here around intervention supports is that both parents and staff were highlighting that there was a range of perspectives that they had in understanding what are the types of both district-wide and school-level understandings of the supports that are available. And specifically is being able to name what is our tiered system of support, right? And if I remember correctly, I think at some point you all had mentioned that a little bit of this emerged in the special ed review, if I remember correctly. But so what I honed in on in terms of recommendations is that there needs to be an establishment, an agreed level of sort of what the district-wide tier system of support looks like, and that it parallels what schools have in place, right? Because part of what we were hearing across, particularly from staff, from a variety of schools, is that they had different understandings in terms of what are the expected processes for when a kid is having some type of whether academic or behavioral struggle, what's expected to happen next. And some of that has to do with, the fact that there was variations by buildings means that there's probably a misalignment with whatever is sort of district-wide. And so that's why I placed this as one of the recommendations, that there be this development of this district-wide tiered system of support.
The variation is in the response or in the structural setup the district has?
The variations are at the building level and the variations were.
That's implicating at the district level.
Right, because if two schools are having different, so one staff talked about sort of if a kid's having struggle, we can send them to the folks who are sitting on the special ed evaluation. So they're moving from, you got difficulty, you're going straight to having talk with this or meeting with the specialized team, which shouldn't be the case, right? There should be an intervention team that provides targeted support at tiered levels before you even talk to an evaluation team, right? So some schools, some staff mentioned that, while others said, oh, we have our RTI team, right? Or the
SRBI.
Yeah.
SRBI.
Yeah. So the fact that there was that variation led me to okay, if there's differences across schools, then it left me wondering sort of what lives at the district level that helps to define that for schools, right? And it has to be, I'm a big fan of, schools need a framework, or container that they can work within so that they can be able to make sure that what they're building out is appropriate for their, what's existing at their school, particularly given that, I'm always presuming that there's differentials at each school, meaning particularly around intervention supports. Like some schools, they may need greater literacy supports because their kids are really struggling around literacy, while another school may be more around numeracy. But as long as they agree, they have the same container of processes for how they're going to provide the support, the targeted supports can be different, right? But the processes are agreed upon, right? So that's why I think that's why I outlined here this sort of district-wide tiered support. I put in there in terms of, particular attention around the SBRI implementation, not the fact that it's there, but rather, is there a consistency in terms of it being implemented? And I don't know if the special ed review touched on the SBRI, you know, there was questions raised around the implementation processes. You know, so I put that in there in terms of just at least some type of review of it to see if there is, as a next step to improve the SBRI.
So that directly correlates with some of the recommendations from the special education review, because they felt that there was no structured SRBI protocols and systems in the district. And that's one of the things that we're trying to build. One, making sure that there is someone supporting the system at large. So as part of the table of organization, one of the things that we are looking into is how do we build in a centralized support so that we build consistency across the system. So that directly correlates with those
Okay.
findings.
Great. You know, also the development within each school of a formal list of what they have existing, and existing meaning that it's operating at a level that you can maintain fidelity of tiered interventions, right? So that means making sure that there is existing types of supports where it's staffed well enough to be able to operate at its optimal level to have the effect with the kids that are having that need, right? So it's, you know, because there was, remember the survey data, staff had a range of understanding whether or not there even was a formal list of tiered interventions available at their school sites. And I give examples of and as you'll see with some of these, I give places to go to get sort of examples of what that could look like, right? The examples I have there are the National Center on Intensive Intervention has these great charts of interventions that have gone through a systematic vetting regarding their effect on different populations in terms of that particular intervention. So like reading recovery or read 180, right? Like those are the types of interventions that live on these lists that are important for, it's, and I have this list or these citations in there because I want to make sure that we're attentive to, it's not any old random sort of intervention, right? It has to be research-based interventions that our kids are being made available to in order to ensure that they're actually having the growth that we can expect for them to make, right? The last recommendation is around, developing the types of tools and protocols for how the intervention team meetings happen, right? So the intervention team meetings are a particular process element of these tiered interventions. These are the folks who, when a staff member says, hey, I have a kid who's struggling and I'm going to fill out this form and show you all this stuff that they're struggling with, there's a team who then takes that information and reviews that information. That team, based on some of the focus groups, some staff were unclear as to whether or not there were, how that team operated, whether or not there were particular protocols involved in it. And I think in the survey data, we had a question around whether or not staff knew if the intervention team was using a problem-solving model for how they were operating. And if I remember correctly, about half of the staff perceived that it was, the other half had no idea, right? So I place that in there in terms of sort of, some developing or reviewing sort of the tools or protocols that are being used for the operation of these intervention teams.
I have a question.
Yes.
So we've gotten feedback that before you even get to an SRBI conversation, the teachers don't feel like they've got training to do the data collection to present at that, but I don't see training. Is that just built up under protocol?
Yeah, that didn't come out in terms of in the focus group data, but I can definitely see that being, one of those capacity areas where it's like, okay, you need me to fill out this stuff and I need to collect this data, but I'm not sure, what do I collect? How do I collect it? To hand it over to a team. And that's plausible sort of issue that for staff to kind of recognize.
And the timing around how quickly these things take place? Is that
Yeah.
rolled up under protocols, or would you say that's also?
So that would be part of sort of the first recommendation around actually having this sort of tiered system, which would include really spelling out what is it that we optimize as the timing that we want to allow for these different steps to occur. There is, like in IDEA, there are guidelines for how long, once an initial referral happens for evaluation, there's a clock that starts, right? And you have 60 days. Is it 60 days? I can't remember. There's a clock that, yeah,
60, 45, 60, and 90.
So you have to meet with it. We don't have that existing when it comes to intervention supports, particularly at tier 1s, 2, and 3. But that may be something that as a district, as your, I'm a big fan of, let's create the container that gives greater guideline. And as we get better, we can start sort of moving away from the discreteness around this. So it may start off by saying, I think at the onset, let's give a container where, when a kid gets referred for a tier 2 support, right, where they need additional support, that we're responding in X amount of time, right? So it doesn't linger for several months where staff is saying, hey, I need help, and the kid is still lingering. There's at least some boundaries to some of that.
I think that a lot of this directly correlates with some of the special education findings. I actually am working with Lauren Katzman, who conducted the special education review. And we're working on a scaffolded plan of action for the district for year 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth, based on the findings of the study. And one of the big pieces is setting up these protocols and systems around SRBI. The other thing that I can tell you is that based on a lot of what we've learned from that study, we are also looking at systematizing an SRBI block throughout the district. So we've been working with all of the schools in making sure as they program their buildings that we have a set block up for SRBI intervention services and enrichment. So depending on where the child is in the spectrum, right, of support, either if they're in GNT, they get enriched services for that. If they need certain interventions, that would be the block of time that they will receive those interventions as per the recommendation of that study and in correlation with some of the findings of the equity project study as well. So that we make sure that we're not only serving, a lot of the times we focus a lot on the kids that need the most intervention and don't think about the other side of the intervention spectrum and how do we accelerate learning for those kids that are ready for that level of acceleration. So we want to create a structure where we are balancing both things and making sure that we're meeting the spectrum of need and support.
So the next part of that strand around adequacy and efficiency is around communication. So in particularly communication for access and opportunity. There is a significant thread of dialogue that emerged among parents and among staff regarding how the manner of communication that's happening with parents regarding critical services was not representing a level of sort of equitable information sort of distribution for everyone, right? So those who knew, and those who didn't even know that they didn't even know, right? And that was something that emerged for both parents. I mean, I have to be honest, the parents really had a lot of stories about things that they have experienced, and the staff were able to substantiate a lot of that, because they were able to also see it from their own vantage point. So some of the areas of recommendation regarding sort of improving the manner of communicating with parents regarding these critical services one is around sort of regularly provide accessible information on enrollment regarding magnet, gifted, honors, and AP, right? That whole, sort of swath of stuff that is around sort of advanced programming is one of those areas that particularly the parents were cognizant that unless you were in the know, You didn't even know when things were occurring and in which school they were occurring, right? So so I strongly recommend that there has to be some type of mechanism of doing regularly, where we're providing sort of regular accessible information. And I would even go so far as making sure that there is a greater level of attention for those communities who have experienced not getting enough regular communication around it, right? So this is not a moment of where there's a need for equal distribution. There is a need for equitable distribution of this information, which means for those who need it the most need to get a greater saturation of it, right? Particularly given that what also has emerged from the result of these different issues around whether it's communication regarding these services, whether it's around school practices, that you have a level to which in these programs you have a pattern of racial ethnic disparity of who's ending up in these, that it's raised a question as to whether or not particularly your racial ethnic minority student populations in the school district feel as if these types of environments are for them, right? So the need to oversaturate information and communication with parents needs to sort of be part of the rationale and strategy for this communication. Also ensuring sort of equitable processes regarding within the special education evaluation process, with a particular attention in how parents without advocates are able to experience an informed process, right? Parents, there was a lot of conversation, and I would say almost every focus group, there was at least one parent who brought up stories around what it's meant for them to not have had an advocate when, as I'll say, there was a staff member who said it so poignantly. They said, for families who don't have advocates, by the time we are seeing them, we really don't have any more services to offer, because those who have advocates have been able to know how to navigate, and get what they need and get it at a level. There were some examples that staff offered where kids were getting more services than they actually should be getting in relation to the need that's presenting, right? And so
that can't be just typical to us. That's got.
Oh no, that's
true of public schools everywhere.
Oh yeah, but it comes back to the degree to which how the various families are able to leverage their own resources to advocate and to get the types of supports that at times are over and beyond what kids actually should be getting in relation to the need that's presenting, right? And I'm sure that there's layers of issues that surrounding why that transpires, but moving forward as a recommendation is ensuring that there's processes that are happening particularly for parents and specifically, your Black and Latinx parents here in the community and I'm trying to remember the different parts of town that people were naming, who they considered were not getting the same level of experience of an informed process regarding special education services. And also, I would add in there as a recommendation, creating some type of process to regularly gather feedback from parents regarding the evaluation process, right? It's almost like a post hoc to what happens once you go through the evaluation process, asking parents, how did it go for you? Because we're trying to make improvements, right? And this is not something that I would recommend it's a permanent thing, but rather as you're trying to get better, let's create an iterative sort of feedback loop so you can know where are we getting it right? Where are we still needing to make improvements? Because you have a lot of schools in your district who have, where parents were saying sort of a range of things of what they're experiencing. So that whole communication element is particularly for parents. I think it's vitally important for you all to consider. All right, so strand 2. So in terms of strand 2, there's I'm gonna sort of go through this first element of Strand 2, which is around, what are the different perspectives on practice and diversity that need to be improved, right? So the first one is around, what we learned was that there is a range of perspectives that individuals are bringing to school setting that are, that is demonstrating their different points of struggle around understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And one of the recommendations that we're making here is that you all develop and implement a professional learning series that focuses on developing sort of a pedagogical lens of staff that includes an expansive cross-cultural competency, right? Their ability to be able to, so it's not just a matter of, I'm doing social emotional learning, but I'm doing social emotional learning with a lens based on a cross-cultural competency, right? So for example, in SEL, one of the competencies is around social awareness and self-awareness, right? So if we're doing that work, let's make sure that staff have a common place of cross-cultural competency. So when they are talking about what it means for me to be socially aware or self-aware, if that's part of the milieu of what the curriculum is having us develop within our schools, that we have a common place of a cross-cultural competency in which we're actually doing that, right? And it's also, I have to say, it's also part of, in that example of SEL, that's what some of the research around SEL is actually, has been developing over the last 5 years in recognizing that in the apps, if there isn't a direct attention to some of these cross-cultural competencies, SEL could utilize and be implemented utilizing a colorblindness sort of belief system, right? Where we're all the same, and my level of social awareness is that I don't see any difference. And so, which may be difficult when kids present, issues that they're experiencing in their communities, and the response among staff is, but we're all the same. I don't agree that these are, set of disparities that are existing, right? And if I may punctuate around that point, I'm thinking about the high school students from, is it Global Studies? I think.
CGS?
Yes, CGS. Because I think that's the group, right, that I met with, who are clear that they're experiencing these disparities, and they're very much interested in not only sort of annotating how there's an absence of some of this cross-cultural stuff, they want to be involved to support the development of staff in terms of helping them understand why it's so important for them that they get exposed.
My son went to CGS, and my experience there were half the kids were not from Norwalk. They were coming from out of town or from other towns, which was part of this. It's a state out of district kind of magnet school. And most of those out of district kids didn't want to be there, and their parents forced them to be there. So there was a lot of, and I don't know, maybe it's changed now. This was a few years ago, but there were different groups of kids. They weren't necessarily interconnecting, and you had a whole group of kids who were not from this town who didn't want to be there, who were forced to be there. So I don't know what they would say to you, but I think you have to take that with a grain of salt, because the dynamic there, these are not Norwalk students.
Right.
But I think there was a lot of kids from Brian McMahon also in that group.
Yeah, exactly. I think part of it's regardless of where they're coming from, their particular point was around not their peers, but the staff, right? Their concern was around what they're experiencing, right? Like, so some of them were sharing things that I would describe as examples of microaggressions, right? That they've experienced within their classes. And
From the teachers,
exactly.
Interesting.
So that's their concern, right? They're interested in sort of developing a cross-cultural climate that is supportive of all of the kids who are in that school setting, right?
And I think
that's just one example.
Yeah, and some of those students were for the Center of Youth Leadership also.
Oh, yes, the leadership group, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't think it was CGS, it was the Center for Youth Leadership.
Oh, okay.
And those kids are Norwalk students.
Yep.
Yeah.
I don't know, because we weren't seeing the board members that were, that are remote. I don't know if we want to pause and see if anyone had questions, because we weren't seeing them, for a minute.
Sure. Just gonna-
Any board member, that is remote have any questions? Okay, just wanted to make sure.
All right. Let's see here. Item number 2. Go
Go
ahead.
back to a prior item, just for clarity.
Yes.
The equity team that's mentioned in the second bullet.
Uh-huh.
Can you speak a little bit to who and what that is? And also, I had a question around just any explicit recommendations as it relates to asserting culture within staff mindsets, or just like
Right.
just in acknowledging there's nothing explicit to.
Right. So, yeah, and thank you for mentioning, I forgot to bring up that second, that sub-bullet under 1. So, so part of the work that's been ongoing is I do these almost monthly sessions with the principals and the assistant principals. First, it was around sort of doing the root cause regarding some of the disparity issues in their schools. And now we are working on developing their capacity in what it looks like to have an equity literacy professional development series, right? So I'm giving them a sort of a snapshot of what that could look like, with the intention of doing something a little bit more substantive with them over the summer with their equity team, right? So one of the things that Dr. Estrella sort of made sure that principals understood that is that they need to build an equity team at their school sites, and by and large, everyone has one, different levels of operation, right, with each one in terms of what they're working on. Some are, I have to say, some of them are rocking it out. Like some of those equity teams have actually reached out to me and said, hey, can we present to you the work that we're doing, right? And they're really moving this forward, to a degree that you have some schools that actually can provide examples of what number 1 can start to look like, because they already started sort of building that out, while others are still finding their way of doing that. But so I put in here as a recommendation of some type of sort of institute where they can just all get together and we can sort of baseline where everybody, what's the stuff they should be doing as they're planning forward for next school year.
And the charge of the equity team at each school site, is it something in specific to their school building that they're working to improve, implement, or is it a district-wide shared agenda for what an equity team does?
So there is a shared understanding that we've been developing as a large group when we meet monthly, right? So, so for example, their first charge was to do a root cause together, to make sure that there is an anchored understanding of what is the disparity in our school and how it's manifested. The second thing was for them as a group to identify an equity goal for right now, right? Like what's one thing that came out of the root cause that let's work on piloting and fixing now, right? So that's what they've been working on. And the intention is that this team is basically building muscle, so that as they start planning for next year, the set of, school goals are inherently carrying an equity lens in what they're sort of building out. So I'm hoping that, part of what the goals that they're setting for next year have inherently, they're using an equity lens to develop those things and relying on their equity team to kind of help boost that up for them, right? So that way it's not left to just the principal and AP to be the only one sitting in the room, but rather let it be a cross-section of people. And in some schools, you can see the effect of having a cross-section of people. You can see at least some of what I've seen in some of the schools where there's, the staff are able to showcase for them, those who are on the equity team, the level of impact or not that something's happening, right? Like one of the schools has been doing work around trying out this practice around equity in grading, right? Because they've noticed a huge disparity in terms of who's ending up with D's and F's and who's ending up with A's and B's, you know? And so, you know, this particular school, the equity team they had worked on, they actually piloted, you know, sort of this new policy around grading. And, you know, they invited me to one of their meetings, I think last month, the month before, and they presented their data in terms of like, where are we? Like, did we make improvements, you know? And what they noticed is that they made slight improvements and they realized we got to do more. It wasn't enough to just for that initial sort of baseline of what they decided on a grading policy. They realized they actually had to do more. So that's what, you know, I want to see more of in terms of these equity teams, where they're taking these core school equity goals and they're the ones who are marching it forward and making sure that it actually happens. So, and then I anticipate that these set of goals that is living at the school site are also going to be in alignment with what the district is defining as, you know, as district goals as well. Item number 2, you know, continuous assessing sort of educator knowledge around the systems that you're going to, you know, continuously sort of have going, that you're developing, whether it's around intervention supports, curriculum instruction, gifted and advanced course enrollment improvements, right? Making sure that, that just a one-time presentation is not enough for a principal to make sure that these new improvements of these systems are baked into the DNA of staff, right? You know, a memo during a staff meeting is not going to cut it, right? So some level of sort of continuous assessment where we're kind of tapping into like, do you feel as if there is, you know, do you know about the intervention systems? You know, is it readily accessible for you to get the forms, whatever it may be, right? Item number 3, you know, develop, particularly at the school sites, parent engagement and support activities that encourage cross-cultural competency. You know, especially activities that create opportunities for intergroup contact, perspective taking, and individuation. You know, because one of the things that came out from the parent survey is that there's limited cross-cultural experiences that parents are having, right? It's basically, you know, what it's showcasing is that whatever patterns of segregation may live in Norwalk is seeping into sort of how people are engaging at a school site, right? So they're not cross-pollinating, right? And so I put in here sort of as a recommendation, particularly at a school site, where they become a little bit more intentional around whenever those parent engagement activities do occur, to find ways to do some intergroup contact, right? So ways in which parents to interface with, in a cross-cultural way with families that may not have typically sort of, you know, sort of engaged with, right? To help normalize the idea that it is okay to have contact with people that are different than you.
Are you talking about different events at the schools?
Yeah.
Things like that?
Yeah, exactly.
Are those the only examples of cross-cultural experiences that were referenced?
Well, those are things that I'm recommending, right? But I know that, you know, so for example, and I think it's on the next slide where I talk about the SGC, yeah, where you know, there is a strong sentiment across a lot of parent focus groups that SGC is not seen as something that is inclusive of racial, ethnic, minority student parents. And there's, particularly in their discussion, they felt that that's an example of feeling excluded, right? And, you know, and for some families, some parents share that, you know, for them, they saw that as a representation of just like, I don't even know how to talk with parents who are in that group because it feels so exclusive, right? So, you know, so that's the only other sort of organization, you know, aside from some people mentioned the PTA. So that may also be another avenue to make sure that whatever happens, let's just make sure that we get parents actually interacting with each other, versus just coming in, I love going to see my kids present or perform something, but let's actually do something so we actually get intermingling happening in these events.
But isn't that true then? It's sports and like you were saying,
Yeah,
talent, orchestra. I mean, you have those families that can't afford the equipment and you have the families that can't afford the instruments or
Yeah.
the extra classes.
Mhm.
So there is another way where kids and families are separated because you don't fall into that same group.
right, exactly.
In other school districts, are SGCs always elected, or is there a half appointed, half elected to, you do ensure that there is diversity and representation?
I've seen all the variations of,
Yeah,
some of it is elected, some it's like volunteer, and some is, it's the,
Even SGCs are volunteer
around here, no,
in other school districts.
in Connecticut? Or,
As a
no,
matter of fact.
I don't,
I thought they were all
it's,
elected as GCs.
yeah, I'm trying to think.
out there, yeah.
But I think there is, I think the election process is one of those that's most common, right? But it's also, as we all know, election is also driven by, the nature of who actually comes out to vote, right? So there's that sort of balance of it, and also sort of the history that people have in terms of feeling included in the school setting to want to participate in whether it's voting or, choosing to run to be part of SGC, right? And also the degree to which they have a relationship with their principals, right? Like there were a few parents who talked about how, they just didn't know if the principal was the one who was driving the selection of the people who would run to be elected, So, which for me, just raised questions around whether or not they feel they have a connection with the leadership of the school, right? So, but in terms of parent activities, whether it's, events or whether it's sports, whether it's, the band, I have a kid in band too, and I'm like, oh my, it is super expensive, right? And you can see the stark difference of those who have resources and those who don't. What, not only sort of who's showing up there, but also what they get exposed to in relation to those things.
Now, in terms of the framework
Mhm.
used currently at the school level equity teams,
Mhm.
are there any recommendations or examples you have for models that we can adopt, to staying consistent with what should be in place at the district level for creating the framework, and also coupling back with something you said a few presentations ago around there being a lack of cultural assessment in the problem identification piece that connects to it. Are there models that we can follow or reference for how a district level team should look to help give structure to what equity teams should look like in terms of their operation at district level?
Right, yeah. There's definitely, I can provide examples of what I've seen, what, sort of a district equity team looks like, but also the guidance that it could give for a school level equity team, especially, I think to a certain degree, given all of the different reports that you all now have available to you, you have great information that can actually help give some structure to these equity teams around, hey, these are some of the things that we're going to work on, and as an equity team, this needs to sit on your plate, so on some level, it gives them a level of operational stuff that they can work on in this next several years. And also, it may help define who needs to be sitting at the table as part of these equity teams as well. To ensure that there's, my sense is from hearing the principals and APs is that right now it's predicated on volunteerism. Who's interested, who wants to be part of doing this work around equity, which is great. And we want to actually continue encouraging that. But there may be some strategic folks who have not participated who may need to, given some of the areas of priority that the district is outlining. But that, your point also raises item number 4 on here, which is, it's great for there to be this school level stuff, but there also needs to be some district level defining what it means that when we say diversity, equity, inclusion, what do we mean, right? So I put on here sort of that there has to be some type of, whether it's an equity policy or statement that reflects sort of the ethical perspectives of diversity, inclusion, and equity that is important and guiding your multi-year operational plan, right? That is clearly states sort of your key acknowledgements of what's important to you all. What are your places, your belief standards, right? And I suggest that, you have enough available to you from these various reports to actually start generating at least some key components of what you all consider is diversity, inclusion, and equity here for Norwalk. And from that, be able to generate some type of initial policy or statement that reflects your components of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then do a feedback process with parents, school staff, and students, and letting them weigh in on what this statement that you all generate, right? So in some ways it's the, drawing on what you learned from the community and from staff and from students to draft the first statement and then go back to them and say, hey, this is the stuff that we heard. This is where we're seeing sort of the important sort of strategic areas of defining diversity, equity, inclusion for us. We'd love to get your feedback on this now, right? A good portion of this is reflection of your own thinking and experience. We want to make sure we're capturing this. That's one of those sort of next recommendations.
On the positive side, technology hasn't come up in any of this. Did you get a good sense that at least something positive came out of COVID and there is now a general sense of equitable distribution of access and
Well, that's the one thing and I included this at the end, part of the report, is that the whole section around the thing that parents talked a great deal about was they were so happy by the way the district was responsive to making decisions around remote or in person. And also in terms of technology, the fact that, that there was accessibility around the technology, in some ways, I was talking with somebody else last week that, there's so many districts now that could be at a place where they've actually set a new baseline, which is all kids have technology, right? Like, which is very different than what we had before.
Mm-hmm.
Before it was like, we tried, some can, and some, now everybody has it. And it's a new foundation now for us to actually imagine sort of doing teaching and learning, and I so hope that we can capitalize on that reality, moving forward. But there is definitely great deal of satisfaction among parents regarding that.
It's the staff, they did it.
So these equity teams that you're discussing at different schools, who would make up these teams? Are they current staff or people that we're looking to hire separately or?
No, it'd be definitely current staff, this is something that you want to leverage the people in these schools who know best the dynamics of how things operate, what the history of what's transpired there, and also are interested in and have a level of agreement around how the district leadership is understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And I think it has, in terms of the membership, right? Ideally, you want to have students, you want to have parents in the actual team, and then personnel that provide an array of expertise to facilitate the conversation. I know that Eddie has been meeting with principals and their teams one-on-one already in setting that up. But right now, I think the stage that they're in is just the principal plus staff, they're still not at the level where they're bringing in students or parents.
Yeah.
Ideally, next year, we would want to have kind of like a descriptive structure of like, at a minimum, these are some of the folks that we would want in this group. And set the expectation around, there has to be at least X number of students, X number of parents, and then the rest would be,
And it'll be the same straight across, so.
and it would be across the schools.
And giving them sort of directives around things they can do, like giving them a list of, for the student side of the group, it'd be great to get students involved in X, particularly to give a bit of a running start for school teams to be able to know what to do. Because, the last thing folks would want to do is be mandated a team, but yet don't know what to work on, right? There's a lot of stuff to work on. And I think having this diversity of people would be great. Right?
Do we have the flexibility next year for it to be virtual? Because we had a lot of feedback in focus groups that the lack of diversity was because it was in person and it was like at 5:30 when people were working until 8 o'clock at night, and if it was virtual and later, you might see that.
I think we have to take that into consideration, like we're doing it now,
Exactly.
right? So it is possible. And I think that one of the things that has come up is the increased participation in certain meetings because of the fact that there is choice. And we shouldn't regress. We should continue to use what we learned from this that has been positive to increase participation and awareness.
I mean, that's one of the great things that's like, that this whole, technology saturation is that, more parents are able to kind of chime in spaces that they previously may not have had the time for, or just, it was like, oh, I got to figure out, I got to get there.
Babysitter.
I got to babysit. Yeah, exactly. Because I'm thinking about some of the focus groups that I did with Spanish speaking parents where, I can tell that, the kids were running around, and around them, and it was okay. They could stay on mute and still be able to sort of listen in on what's transpiring, So that leads to sort of this last area of recommendation, which is around improving, parent opportunities for school decision-making, right? Like the parents, and to this point, which is like parents are wanting for more, they want to be involved in what's happening, but have felt that there's moments in which they're getting excluded. And I think, and that's where the SGC component has been, there was a lot of conversation around SGC. And so I think there has to be, somehow there's got to be an improving the process of the opportunities to participate in SGC. And some of that could be, some of the improvement, it needs to involve sort of who's getting on. To be, put it bluntly, and maybe it involves sort of some type of interim process. Now, and I say interim doesn't necessarily need to be permanent, but some type of interim process that ensures that the SGC is representative of the racial ethnic student enrollment of the school.
I think, like Mike, you brought it up, the with the SGCs, it's like standardizing and having like protocols across the system around the election process and like how we are.
Yeah, because look, let's face it, many of the schools are no contested elections. So this idea that you've got to get people involved, they can barely get a full slate of candidates at some schools. Other schools there is a contested, and where there's a contested election, there's no accountability. The principal is counting the ballots, and that principal might not like a certain parent to be on the SGC. So they're like, whoops, they didn't get that many votes. There's no way to check that. I know of 2 schools where I think there were funny votes. There was no way to prove one way or the other if the principal gamed it or not. So if we're going to give this much power to the SGCs, I think we have to do a better job, central office and the board, of making sure these are fair in elections, which there's no proof to suggest they are.
Right.
And I think we as board members have to step out of our comfort zone and talk to the community to get people to step up and join the SGCs, have those conversations. Because I'm sure there's a lot of people, like you said, that won't step up because they feel that they don't belong there or they're not welcome.
Right, exactly.
So,
You know,
Have any of the SGCs had an opportunity to respond, react to some of the, what was vibrant in the feedback you're describing?
How, no, not that I know. I mean,
this is the first time it's been.
It's the first, yeah.
Got it.
yeah.
I think I think to Mike's point, we had like formally, like they call them school leadership teams, right? Because every place has a different way of calling some same thing. But we would have a third party count ballots. We would send someone from central office to be part of the election process. So that's something that we, as we plan for the work forward, we might want to consider having a third party support. It would be like a family district liaison or something of that nature, but there was a person that supported the school in the election process. So that's something that we could definitely consider. I think one of the other things that I heard a lot is language access, right? Because a lot of parents might want to participate, but because they don't speak English, they don't have access to the information. And I feel like as in the board, we've kind of standardized having interpretation for families to have access, which do we have it today?
No, for the retreats, we'll get them afterwards, so we'll send
Okay.
those to yep.
So I know that that's a challenge. What came up in those conversations around that piece? Because I know that that's one of the things
Yeah.
that.
And that gets to sort of item number 2, which is improved communication with parents, right? So that first one is the continued use of the virtual platform to connect with families into next year. Improve, accessibility and utilization of language services, translation services for families, particularly Haitian Creole and Spanish, right, was brought up. And the last piece in terms of improved communication is around, the centralization of information regarding critical enrollment and services, particularly around Magnet and Gifted, that the district take a role in that sort of rallying the ways in which communication is happening to parents, which would include making sure that not only so people know stuff, but they're getting in the languages that makes the most sense for them to receive it and for them to respond. And that's it. Those are the recommendations.
Any questions from the board members that are remote?
That means I must have been very clear.
You're very thorough.
Was there any preferred method of communication that they went?
I'm trying to think if there were any. I have to go back and look at the data because I think there's probably, I think they may have sort of identified some communication that was probably most useful for them. But I can't think off the top of my head. But yeah.
I will say, I don't know if Suzanne can hear what I'm saying, but she did a lot of really great work. She had one of the best SGCs, I think, in the district. And she had really good, there she is, really good involvement from different groups that I don't know how you did it, Suzanne, but she had people you'd never seen before and kind of parents from a really wide cross section. It was really impressive. And I don't know, however she did that, we should be sharing with our current principals.
I mean, I was really purposeful of making sure that I sent out communications a million different ways. I talked to, people who would come to a parents club meeting. I have interpreters at that. And then I would just kind of, say, I need you. Like I can't have all the same perspectives on things, but I have to say it was a lot of work. Mike, thank you for recognizing what we did. But I think something I like in listening to this, and this isn't questions for Dr. Fergus, but more our team is, and I don't know if there's a push that can maybe come from our team, from central office, to say to people how important school governance councils are. I think all principals probably do that. And I just used to say that this was a really important group, that there was a way for me to get feedback from parents, as many different parents who they represented their groups. And then I had certain parents who wouldn't be on it, but then I'd say, like, so talk to 20 of your friends and tell them to talk to 20 of their friends.
Susanna, I heard you say an important thing.
I mean, work. But I do think that the idea of, especially if there's any feeling that there's impropriety in how elections are held, the idea that maybe it's centralized, maybe there's a date that everybody goes to school governance council and it's done online and it goes through the board or something could help with that perception. But I know it was just a lot of work of beating the bushes.
Suzanne, can I just add in, thank you. And Mike, I echo all the great work, Suzanne, that you've done over the years with our school governance council. But, if we kind of look back a bit, when we looked into having a school governance council, I mean, we did a lot of research, a lot of background on it, and we knew it was one of the most important positions a parent would have, and a voice. And we started out very early on making sure that it was fair and equitable, and we had a wide range of parents that were interested, and we wanted to make sure we did that outreach. And I think we need to revisit that again, because we want to make it as fair as possible, and also reflect the community at large in Norwalk. So, having that outreach and really working on getting parents, and many of our parents are involved, but we also want new parents coming in. That was also the whole point of having different viewpoints, different thoughts, different ideas, and having parents actively engaged. And we do have parents that are actively engaged, but we really want to incorporate that into our school governance council. So I think we kind of have to look at it in a different lens this go around, and figure out best practices and what we can do, and looking at Brian McMahon, Suzanne, over the years, and looking at some of our model schools that really kind of have a handle on it and are really doing it the way that it was intended to be done. So I think, again, and that's something policy has to look at as well, but also as a whole board, I think even having different voices from the board talking about it and thinking how we want to make our school governance council be the best that it can be. And I think, Eddie, with some of the work that you've done and some of the feedback, we're hearing that there's some issues, and we know that, and we just have to figure out how we can get a handle on that and make it as fair as possible for our parents.
And I think, Suzanne, you said a really important thing, the piece around like having interpretation available, and to the point of reaching out to as many subcommittee groups within the school as possible. And I think one of the things that we have to think about as a district is how do we systematize providing language access across all these essential meetings, right? Because the SGCs are, if we see them as a vital component of like how parents engaged in the schools, then we have to make sure that all parents have access to the resource. Because it could be that because they don't have an understanding of what's being communicated, they might shy away from participating. And I can see having something as simple as interpretation could potentially increase the diversity of the groups involved in the conversation as well. Because to Heidi's point, a lot of great work has been done. It's a matter of like building some of the elements that we need to further develop to strengthen the practice.
There's also a lot of overlap with the PTA. Like, I can remember looking at our lineup of PTA parents and our lineup of SGCs, and there was like a parent difference.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's just like there's just too many things for parents to do.
I think it is part of the growing pains, I think, because SGCs are pretty new. And I think at different schools have played out differently. But you're right, there were a lot of places where it was kind of like, what's the SGC? What's the PTA? And it wasn't really clear. And you maybe had it like at Cranberry, I remember there was a core group of like 12 moms, and there was this couple of women who I think were on both, which it was not supposed to be that way, but it just played out that way. And so I think that hopefully is over time as they develop, you'll see they're kind of two different tracks depending on what you want to do.
Mhm.
If you're really involved in running the school versus maybe more fundraising and providing, additional services or whatever for kids. And so I think they are two different things, but it is hard to keep them separate, especially initially.
And in some places, there are policies around that, right? Like where they have the SGC and the PTA. And usually what happens with the SGC body, the PTA president will be the one that will sit in the SGC because then they could be the connection between the two organizations. But beyond the PTA president, they wouldn't you couldn't double up into between the two groups so that there was a diverse population of people within the two.
Like in certain schools, I think it's maybe what Erica's, like a place like Kendall, where you don't even have a PT. I mean, you didn't 5 years ago, you didn't even have a functioning PTA. All of a sudden you're like, oh, we're gonna have a PTA and an SGC, and you don't have any in either. To cultivate that, it becomes almost one kind of like, these are the parents that want to be involved and they'll do whatever. And I think it's more at like schools really Suzanne cultivated. I don't think, Brian McMahon was that way forever. There was this parents club and there was a certain set of people involved in that. And then there was a whole different group of people who were on the SGC and never the twain shall meet. It was really defined. It was probably because of her leadership and it's a bigger school. She's got more volunteers, whatever. And, in a place like, I think the schools I know, like at Rowayton, they were really two different groups of parents. And so they were pretty separate. But then at Rowayton, there weren't as many parents involved. And so it was for a long time, I think neither party really was sure what their role was. And I think now, 5 years into it, I think it's better.
Yeah. But then
So I think each school has its own path.
Situation. But I think it helps push having two diverse groups when you set parameters in terms of how many can combine. And I think now that we have, Zoom and Team and all these different platforms, I think we might be able to get more folks participating that didn't participate in the past.
I think that's, I'm seeing that NASA, like the taxing district where I'm a commissioner, we moved completely to Zoom. And just last week, we had our monthly meeting and we said, we're going to do in person starting in May. And all these people are like, no, we want to be able to call in on Zoom. And I do all the IT and I'm like, let me tell you something. I don't know how to do both. So I don't know, Ralph, I might have to have a little consultation with you. But it was, people really were like, look, I'm not going to come to a meeting in person, but I will participate in a meeting online. And some of these people, they don't even have little kids, but they're busy lives, whatever. So I think we will get a level of engagement we've never had before because of this, because of technology and Zoom and everyone kind of, it's suddenly part of our day-to-day lives.
And then there is the other part, the other half of it is getting the technology to these groups so that they can Zoom and do all the other platforms. There's a lot of the SGCs and PTOs and PTAs don't have Zoom.
And that's something we could definitely help support, build accounts for, because we did it with with one of the parent groups.
PTOC.
The PTOC. We helped them set up a Zoom account and an email box so that they had a means of communicating. So we could do something similar at every school as well.
I think that's a really great idea because I think we'll get a lot more engagement and a lot more parents knowing that they have that option, either in person or if they can and they prefer to Zoom, then that would work. So I do think there'll be a whole higher level of engagement and more parents that might be looking to say, this is something I can do. I can do this from my home. I've got a family, but I can make sure that I'm still engaged and being part of the process and being part of the dialogue and the conversations. So I think that's something we should look at. I think that makes a lot of sense.
And I think Ralph has mastered already kind of like the sound and like the system. So we have kind of already kind of figured out how to do this as effective as we possibly can, so we can support schools to do the same.
Yeah, so the goal is each school actually does have a Zoom account right now. The principals, each one does, and they do use it to an extent. But you're right, the system that you're seeing right now is one of the things we want to get a setup like this, at least a smaller setup in each school, so that then you could actually have a conversation
Mhm.
outside. Yes. that is all.
I mean, it's really changing how we do school, where now all this technology has given us an opportunity to, we were doing the technology because of a pandemic. Now we're gonna be able to do this just to do this. Like, it becomes the new normal of how we can actually make sure that people can chime in whenever they can, however they can.
And it's an opportunity to broaden access,
Yeah.
right?
It is, it's huge.
And I think there's a chance that it's gonna stay the new normal for people in their lives, right? I think businesses are gonna keep this kind of remote and in person and a hybrid, that people are more and more used to it. And I think that idea that they can literally just jump on and be off and not have to travel is so important to working parents who are running around a million miles an hour. To be able to participate in a continual basis, I think this is a big plus.
And I think as we think about resources, this is one of the things we need to take into consideration, as well as how do we expand the interpretation structures that we've set up with the board to schools now. Because I think that that's going to also be part of our new normal, given the language diversity that continues to grow in Norwalk. And if we really want to provide access, we're gonna have to also think about how do we make it language accessible as well.
So are we all good? Any other questions from anyone? Any last words, Dr. Strahan?
No, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us tonight. This is one piece of many others that will help us form the work ahead to finalize the strategic plan. And I'm looking forward to the work that's going to happen May 18th, or the initial presentation of the draft of our strategic plan that's going to set the roadmap for the work ahead. I think great work has happened, one with this equity project, as well as many of the other studies that have taken place thus far. So kudos to the team. Thank you, Dr. Fergus, and the board at large for supporting us as we continue to move forward and setting the path to further develop the work that has started and has been done to continue to move Norwalk in the right direction.
Ralph, I saw something come up on the chat. Is there anything that we needed to know?
I think it was just thank yous.
Okay, so thank you everyone for being here tonight, and thank you, Dr. Fergus, for this great presentation and all the information that we look forward to making changes and working with the community, for our children.
You're welcome.
We good? Motion to adjourn?
Adjourn.
Okay. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night.